Warning, this video contains sensitive content relating to sexual assault. While the scene itself won't be showed on screen, what occurs in it will be discussed. Viewer discretion is advised. Greetings one and all, I'm Red Angel and welcome to another episode of Late Night Ponderings, my series of mini editorials that covers a wide range of subjects. Today's subject? Screaming from the Edge, Goblin Slayer and Rising of the Shield Hero. Let's not mince words here. I can't properly describe how much I despise the word edgy. I know it's become a modern day colloquialism in the evolving, critical thinking vernacular of the internet, but that doesn't change my stance on it. Just like how I've actively spoken against using Dark Souls as a measure of difficulty for every single video game that exists, I find edgy to be one of the most reductive terms one can use in describing a form of media to someone. For those who are unfamiliar, here is what the term means according to urbandictionary.com. Edgy, used to describe something that is excessively dark, often to the point where its overbearingly depressive nature could be considered humorous. As of late, this term is mostly used to describe everything from video games to television series that just so happens to explore the more morose subjects in their respective universes. I've seen a considerable rise in its usage among those in the anime community, particularly when the show Goblin Slayer came out in 2017. More recently, it was used to describe the rising of the Shield Hero. These are just a couple of examples of this, but take a look back on some of the anime shows that have come out in the past 10 years or so. You'll notice many of the horror-based anime or anime with more nightmarish imagery and subject matter will no doubt receive this label, criticism, or what have you. Anything from Elfen Lied to Madoka Magica to Higurashi has the potential to be the target of this blasé critique. I find this troubling because while the evolution of language is inevitable, it appears that we are streamlining things in order to ridicule them rather than provide criticism. One could argue that the term edgy is just being used as a way to exploit sensitive subjects or showing scenes that would provide shock value to the viewer in order to get a response. Reactive media is hardly new, especially considering that there is an entire genre of online media dedicated to this in reaction videos. Many believe that modern day media uses sudden twists, genre, and tonal shifts as a way to get people talking online, and in a way, that's correct. Online buzz is a way to get a show trending, and whether it's a reboot of an 80s property assailed by a group of nostalgia-blind misanthropes, a complete twist on genre when rebooting a classic show, or even a shocking event in the first episode making waves of outrage, I'd be ignorant to say that controversy didn't sell. It's why clickbait titles and summaries are so lucrative in online journalism, particularly game journalism. Of course, this doesn't mean that clickbait or shock value are a sign of quality in a piece of media, but I feel as though I'm getting off topic. This would be a good subject for another day. What I'd like to address, is there a difference between good and bad dark twists? Or is everything just edgy and try-hard? I can't believe those words just left my mouth. Anyways. To me, edgy doesn't remotely cover things that are poorly executed twists of tone and genre. One must dissect something further in order to explain why it doesn't work within the context of the story, or, in many cases, the establishing moments of the work in question. For example, let's talk about that sticky wicket that is Goblin Slayer. I won't be showing the scene from episode 1 that caused all the controversy, but I will be discussing the episode itself, so be warned. However, due to the risk of using too much footage of said episode, and making people uncomfortable, and, you know, potential copyright strikes from lingering too much on the same footage, I will be resorting to videos of frogs. If you are afraid of frogs, I'm sorry, but I promise you, these will be much more pleasant to look at. The first episode's twist in Goblin Slayer was that the goblins were in fact assaulting females in order to reproduce, because goblins in this story are all universally male. This is shown in far more graphic detail than in both the light novel, in which all the other adaptations were based, and even in the manga, which is typically the exact opposite as far as adaptations go. I'd like to call this the inciting incident of most of the controversy surrounding the series and for future events that occur within. It's what drives the priestess to join up with the Goblin Slayer, which eventually leads him to be found by the Elven Archer and her companions. This serves as a way to show how cruel the world of Goblin Slayer is to overconfident novice adventurers who don't know anything about the monsters they're about to face. It's to establish how dangerous even low-level creatures can be, and how Goblin Slayer perform some sort of civic duty by slaughtering the goblins like they're a plague upon this earth. Which, as far as he's concerned, they are. There's no moral quandary, really, to whether or not what he's doing is wrong, because early on in the story it's conveyed that the babies of goblins will eventually grow into complete monsters no matter what the circumstances, leaving the conflict within the story pretty black and white, which is not a sign of bad writing, just painting very clear boundaries of what is considered good and evil, a staple in fantasy stories. Without picking this apart too much, let's address the hulking mastodon in the room that is staring down at us. Is this a bad dark twist, and could it have been done better? Well, the answer is yes and no. Call this playing devil's advocate, but I understand why the author made this choice to establish the world's hierarchy in the first chapter. It was to set up the setting and the various dangers that lurk beneath the surface. This is an example of the author trying to do world building by showing the most vile, gut-wrenching things imaginable to open up the story in order for us to be prepared for the onslaught of terrors that were to come. Many authors do this, and there's typically nothing wrong with this. However, the whole thing did come off as unnecessary in regards to me sinking my teeth into the darkness of the world. Allow me to explain how this entire thing could have been improved. I find elements like this to be better suited for reveals a little later on after establishing more of the main characters. Now, don't get me wrong, I do think the newbie adventuring party should have still met with these terrible fates, with the priestess escaping, traumatized, but I don't think that it should have been shown. Much like the all-female adventuring party we are shown in the second part, we could have seen the gory aftermath of it, that being a far more effective way of establishing to the audience what danger the heroes are in. You could even have the priestess revealing what happened to the party in a flashback, similar to the flashbacks her party members had before they met their grim fates in the manga, giving her a little bit more of a broken bird aspect to her character, which would only make sense considering what she's seen. Implications are quite a bit stronger than fully dragged out scenes, especially in the written medium, and while I know the rule is show don't tell, there are a variety of ways the showrunners could have potentially done this if the author had chosen to go this route. The biggest problem with this stark darkness at the beginning is that the rest of the series reads more like a slightly dark shonen adventure than something within the same realm as, let's say, Berserk? Which this is compared to more often than not. Interestingly enough, I find Goblin Slayer's style to be far more similar to Grimgar Fantasy and Ash after the first episode, that is. This is another isekai-like show about a novice adventuring party going to fight goblins with unfortunate results. Grimgar starts us off slow by showing us that the heroes are only assigned one goblin to slay, something that they fail miserably at, similar to the adventuring party in episode 1 of Goblin Slayer. And yet, instead of dying for their mistakes, they learn from them. You could say they take it to heart because they immediately start learning the skills and applying actual battle tactics to their next few quests. So much so that they start taking on bigger and bigger goblin dens, learning from each flaw in their battle strategy. Despite this, one of the main characters ends up dying fairly early on in the series' run. The intrepid group of adventurers receive a nasty wake-up call about just how vulnerable they really are. This time and build-up is what Goblin Slayer sorely takes for granted. It genuinely has issues with establishing its tone, steering right back into the more fantasy comedy route after the dour first episode. While it does switch back and forth between the darker elements of the world and the adventuring party with their shenanigans, the mood whiplash is absolutely nausea-inducing sometimes. Yet when I hear people recommending this show in the dens of comic book stores or game shops, I hear these words spoken aloud, which leaves me both vexed and perplexed at the same time. They say, just ignore the first episode. That shouldn't be something you have to tell someone, considering the first episode of most anime is the establishing episode for the show and its characters. In that same vein, let's talk about Rising of the Shield Hero, a more recent show which has been met with the same level of controversy as Goblin Slayer. While I don't find this to be entirely surprising, I do find it to be a bit odd because if you compare the two shows, while they do both have unfortunate implications with their protagonists, Shield Hero knows how to build things up a lot better. It also doesn't have sexual assault play out on screen, so that's already a big difference. This is honestly because Shield Hero chose to go the route of establishing things in such a way that while it does fall into the same trap as Goblin Slayer does of typical anime mishaps and mayhem, it tries to maintain that this world, for a time, actively hates Naofumi because of the crime he's accused of in the first episode. There's more of a clear build-up to what we are shown, and and a tone that is relatively well maintained throughout the series. It also gives Naofumi a character arc from a misanthropic nerd to a bitter, cynical, greedy man who trusts no one, and into a hero who has been wronged by those in power and chooses to fight against them. This certainly doesn't excuse Rising of the S.H.I.E.L.D. hero's unfortunate implications in its portrayal of slavery, or that they decided that the unspeakable crime that Naofumi is accused of is sexual in nature rather than something like murder, which seems to be a much easier crime to frame a person for in a medieval setting, but there I go again, applying logic to an isekai light novel adaptation. I should have learned back in Sword Art Online. Look, everything that is morally objectionable and flawed in S.H.I.E.L.D. Hero is a subject that can be spoken of at length in a different video. In spite of all that, it somehow manages to add more humanity to the story than Goblin Slayer, which ends up coming down to the writing itself, most of the story's high points being within character interactions. S.H.I.E.L.D. Hero has strong moments for characters both with and without the backdrop of a dramatic moment happening during or prior to said development. It also shows minor characters in a more humanized light, even going as so far as to present Naofumi, our main protagonist, as a complex and well-rounded character. The character of Goblin Slayer isn't necessarily a bad one, having a positive flat character arc within the same realm as someone like Goku. Where the issue lies is within the pitch blackness of the first episode and future tonal shifts afterwards. The series has a hard time blending these elements together, making the shifts between comedic moments and the more serious moments like you're watching two different shows. S.H.I.E.L.D. Hero has an easier time alchemically mixing these things together, albeit not seamlessly, by any stretch of the imagination, but more competently than Goblin Slayer. What does that mean for the word edgy then? As I stated earlier, calling a piece of media edgy all because it does something outside the norm or it has a kind of dark twist is an absolutely vile form of criticism for the broad spectrum of media we are introduced to. From what I've explained here, it's hard to deny the fact that I find Goblin Slayer to be the most egregious of all that I've described in terms of its content. However, that doesn't mean I think it deserves to be sentenced to the edgy void as a form of divine punishment from the great gods of critics, to be ruthlessly mocked by those who like using a marketing term as a quick form of critique, so they don't have to break down what's actually wrong with it. Media needs to be judged by its own perceived failings and achievements. I'm not saying that we should ignore the content within shows like Goblin Slayer and S.H.I.E.L.D. Hero. If these things make you uncomfortable, then don't watch or read it. It's one of the benefits of those things like rating systems and content warnings at the beginning of every episode. Well, when Crunchyroll actually remembers to put one of those on the show, that is. In what realm of existence does Goblin Slayer fit under the MPAA rating of PG? You know, the same rating of beloved Disney Pixar's Inside Out? I can't see a difference, can you? When criticizing a work, if you can only think of using a single term like edgy or try-hard within your piece, you honestly have a lot more to worry about than your lack of vocabulary. I've seen better arguments against these sorts of works using past trends of media as an example, and frankly, they're much more compelling and accurate arguments than just saying something along the lines of, "It's edgy trash, don't watch it," is about as valid as calling a character a Mary Sue without further extrapolating on them as a whole. If all you can think of is using a single phrase or word in your critical think piece, then it may be time for you to sit down and ponder upon what critical thinking actually entails. I'm Red Angel, and I'll see you next time.